A man I had never met called me by my maiden name, Miriam Okafor, and began referencing an estate I never knew existed. The sound of my father's name, spoken in the past tense by a stranger, felt like a stone dropping into the deep, quiet well of my grief. I was 62 years old, and for the first time in 38 years, I was living alone in the house on Cascade Road where Raymond and I had raised our children. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier. The quiet it left behind was an entity in itself, a constant presence that absorbed sound and warmth. My life had been pared down to a series of quiet rituals: rejoining the alto section of the church choir, tending to the hydrangeas my father had planted in the backyard, and every Friday, a fish fry with my sister Loretta, using the cast iron skillet he'd seasoned back in 1971. These things were the load-bearing walls of my new, smaller life. Everything else felt like drywall, thin and easily broken. Raymond had left for a woman of 34, an age that felt less like a number and more like a statement. It was a repudiation of our shared history, of the two ventures I had funded with my own savings, of the quiet competence he had always mistaken for judgment. The humiliation of his career stalling while mine had been steady and successful was a silent third party in our marriage for years. Apparently, ambition works both ways. Now, this voice on the phone, smooth and professional, was speaking of trusts and portfolios. It didn't make sense. My father, Ezekiel Okafor, was the son of a sharecropper from rural Georgia. He had worked for the city water department for 40 years. He was a man of profound dignity and even more profound silence. His wealth was in his character, not in a brokerage account, or so I had believed. "Mr. Reese," I said, my voice steady. It was the voice I used at the USDA when a junior analyst made a significant error in a crop yield projection. Calm, factual, leaving no room for emotion. "I believe you have the wrong person. My father passed away 2 years ago. His estate was modest and settled without issue." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, orderly rustle of paper. "Mrs. Baines." "Forgive me, Ms. Okafor. My instructions were very specific. Ezekiel Okafor, your father. He established a series of agricultural trusts beginning in 1985. He named you as the sole beneficiary, with management to be transferred to you upon a specific life event." My breath caught. A cold sensation, sharp as menthol, spread through my chest. "What life event?" "The final decree of your divorce from Raymond Baines," he said, his tone unchanged. "My instructions were to contact you the day the 90-day appeal window closed. That was yesterday." The silence in my kitchen was suddenly immense. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant groan of a MARTA bus down on the main road. It all faded. All I could hear was the blood pulsing in my ears. My father had been a quiet man, but he had not been a simple one. He had watched my marriage with an observer's stillness, his opinions kept behind his teeth. He had never liked Raymond, but he had respected my choice. Or, I was beginning to realize, he had simply planned for it. "I don't understand," I said, and it was the truest thing I had said in months. "I imagine you don't," Mr. Reese replied, with a hint of warmth. "That's why he asked me to explain it in person. Would you be available to come to my office tomorrow morning? I'm in the Colony Square building." I looked around my kitchen. The counters were clear, wiped clean from breakfast. A stack of mail sat in a neat pile by the phone. Everything was in its place, just as I liked it. Just as Raymond had always found so suffocating. I felt a tremor in my hand and placed it flat on the cool granite of the countertop to still it. "Yes," I said. 10 o'clock. After I hung up, I stood motionless for a long time. The initial shock was giving way to a slow-blooming dread. Money, in my experience, was never simple. It was tangled up in obligation and expectation. Raymond had taught me that. Twice, I had liquidated stock my father had helped me buy years before I ever met him, pouring nearly $300,000 into Raymond's dreams. First, a consulting firm that never found a client, then a high-end car detailing service that drowned in overhead. He had accepted the money with the casual assurance of a man who believes he is owed it. When he left, he called it a shared marital loss. Grief makes people very easy to persuade. During the divorce proceedings, I had been operating in a fog. My lawyer, a competent woman recommended by a friend, had handled the details. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted the constant, low-grade ache of the betrayal to be contained within a set of signed papers. I remembered sitting in a conference room, not unlike the one I was now being summoned to, signing document after document. My signature, a weary scrawl, a thought, cold and sharp, cut through the fog. The financial disclosure. I walked from the kitchen to the small office I'd maintained for years, the one where I analyzed commodity futures for the government until my retirement. My files were meticulous. The divorce records were in a gray accordion file labeled Baines R.V. Okafor Baines M. I pulled it from the cabinet, the cardboard smooth and cool beneath my fingers. I found my copy of the final disclosure agreement. I spread the stapled pages on my desk, the dense black type stark against the white paper. I had read it at the time, of course, but I had read it for content, not for nuance. My mind had been on the division of our life, the house, the pension, the modest savings. Now I read it as an analyst. I looked for the clauses that were not standard, the language that felt just slightly out of place. And then I saw it. Page 4, Section 2B, Subsection 3. A clause concerning future assets. It was expertly worded, couched in the kind of legalese designed to be skimmed. It stated that any significant inheritance or financial windfall received by either party within 180 days of the final decree could be subject to a reopening of the equitable distribution settlement. It was a discretionary clause, not a mandatory one, but it was there. My stomach dropped. It felt like stepping off a curb I hadn't seen. 180 days. 90 days had just passed. The window was wide open. Raymond's attorney had drafted this document. My attorney had reviewed it and called it standard boilerplate. And I, exhausted and wanting only peace, had signed it. I had signed it without recognizing the weapon hidden in the fine print. My father had waited for me to be free. But Raymond, it seemed, had been waiting for something else entirely. The next morning, I drove downtown with a rigid composure I did not feel. The Atlanta skyline, usually a source of civic pride, felt imposing, its glass towers reflecting a cold, indifferent sky. Calvin Reese's office was on the 32nd floor, a suite of rooms that smelled of lemon oil and quiet money. The receptionist led me to a corner office with a panoramic view of Midtown. Mr. Reese stood to greet me. He was a tall, slender man in his late 50s, with graying temples and a kind, intelligent face. He wore a simple dark suit, and his handshake was firm and dry. He did not resemble the predatory lawyers of television. He looked like a man who kept secrets for a living. "Ms. Okafor, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a leather armchair opposite his wide mahogany desk. "Please, can I get you some coffee? Water?" "Water would be fine, thank you," I said. My throat was tight. He poured it himself from a crystal pitcher, the water making a soft liquid sound as it hit the glass. He placed it on a coaster beside me and returned to his seat. He didn't begin immediately. He simply waited, allowing me to acclimate to the room. to the altitude, to the gravity of the moment. My father, I began, my voice a little unsteady. You said he was a remarkable man, Calvian said quietly, one of the most astute investors I have ever had the privilege of representing, and one of the most patient. I shook my head slowly. My father worked for the water department. He bought savings bonds. He had a pension. He was careful, not an investor. Calvin smiled, a small knowing expression. He was, Miss Okafor, with your guidance. My guidance? Yes. He told me the whole story when we first met. It was back in the early 80s. You were fresh out of business school, working your first job at the Department of Agriculture. You came home for a visit, and you told him that the smart money wasn't in stocks, not for the long haul. It was in the things people would always need: water, land, food. The memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharp. I was 24, full of the certainty of youth and a fresh MBA, sitting at my father's kitchen table in this very house, explaining the fundamentals of agricultural commodities: pork bellies, soy futures, corn, wheat. I told him it was the foundation of everything. He had listened, nodding slowly, his dark eyes thoughtful. I thought he was just being a proud father, indulging his daughter's new expertise. I remember, I whispered. He listened, Calvin continued. He took his entire savings, a little over $70,000, and asked you to show him how to invest it. You did. You helped him open a brokerage account, and you walked him through the first few trades. And then, he said, you got busy. You met your husband. You started your life. You forgot all about it. I had. Life had swept me up. Marriage, children, career. I'd assumed he'd cashed it out or made a little money and put it in something safer. I never asked. It felt impolite. My father's finances were his own. He never forgot, Calvin said. He slid a thick, binder-bound document across the desk. The cover was simple, dark blue vinyl with a typed label: the Ezekiel Okafor Agricultural Trust. He never sold a single thing you advised him to buy. He just let it grow. For nearly 40 years, he reinvested every dividend. He lived on his city pension, never touching a dime of this. He treated it like a buried treasure, something he was guarding for you. My hands were trembling as I opened the binder. The first page was a summary statement. I read the numbers, but my brain refused to assemble them into a coherent figure. The columns of digits swam before my eyes. I had spent my entire career analyzing numbers like these, but they had always been abstractions. Millions of bushels, thousands of metric tons. These were different. I looked at the final number at the bottom of the page. Then I looked at it again. $2.14 billion. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the arms of the chair, my knuckles white. It was an impossible number, a fantastical number. It belonged to corporations, to tech billionaires, not to the son of a sharecropper who smelled of soil and old spice. This can't be right, I stammered. It is, Calvin said gently. Agricultural land values, futures contracts, water rights, seed and fertilizer company stocks. Your father's portfolio reads like the bedrock of the American food supply. He was a genius. He saw the pattern long before the hedge funds did, because you showed him how to see it. I closed the binder. The weight of it felt physical, immense. $2 billion, a sum so large it felt meaningless. What I felt was not joy or even relief. It was a profound, aching sorrow. This was the testament of my father's love, a secret he had carried for my entire adult life. A love so vast and quiet I had never even noticed it. He had built me an ark, while I was busy navigating a marriage that was slowly taking on water. And suddenly, I understood something. The clause in the divorce decree wasn't boilerplate. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap. "Mr. Reese," I said, my voice regaining its strength. "My ex-husband. He put a recapture clause in our divorce settlement." Calvin's kind expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He nodded slowly. "I see. Tell me about it." I explained the language I had found, the 180-day window. As I spoke, the pieces began to click into place in my mind. Raymond's sudden insistence on using his own lawyer, a man I'd never met. His odd questions in the months before he left, asking about my father's health, about his will. I had thought it was morbid curiosity. It was reconnaissance. "He knows," I said, the certainty of it landing like a block of ice in my stomach. "Somehow, he knows about this." "That seems unlikely," Calvin said. "Your father was the most discreet man I have ever known. The trust documents were ironclad. Only he and I knew the full extent." "But it's the only explanation," I insisted. "Why else put that clause in? It's too specific. He was waiting for this. He orchestrated the timing of the divorce to fall right before this window." Calvin leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "If that's true, then he's already planning his next move, a motion to reopen the settlement. He'll argue that you had knowledge of this inheritance and failed to disclose it. He'll claim it's a marital asset." "But I didn't know," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You're the first person to ever tell me." "I know that," he said calmly, "and we have your father's letter of instruction to prove it. But that won't stop them from trying to drag this through the courts. They'll try to freeze the assets, bury us in discovery. They'll hope you'll be so tired of fighting, so desperate to avoid a public spectacle, that you'll offer a settlement just to make them go away." He paused, his gaze steady. "Your ex-husband is counting on you being the same woman he divorced, exhausted and willing to concede for the sake of peace." A quiet fire began to burn in my chest, melting the ice. He was right. That was exactly what Raymond was counting on. He had seen my grief as a weakness to be exploited. He had mistaken my desire for a dignified end to our marriage as a lack of resolve. "He is mistaken," I said. The words were quiet, but they held the density of stone. Calvin Reese allowed himself another small smile. "That's what your father was counting on, too." That Friday, the smell of hot oil and cornmeal filled my kitchen. Loretta was at the stove, her movements efficient and familiar as she slid another piece of whiting into my father's skillet. The hiss and crackle was a sound so deeply embedded in my memory, it felt like a part of my own heartbeat. She had been coming over every Friday since Raymond left, an unspoken pact of sisterly solidarity. "You're quiet today, Mimi," she said, not turning from the stove. "Quieter than usual." I was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of iced sweet tea sweating onto a napkin in front of me. I had spent 2 days processing my meeting with Calvin Reese. The reality of the money was still abstract, but the reality of the betrayal was sharp and clear. "I have something to tell you," I said. I told her everything. About the phone call from Mr. Reese, the meeting, the trust. I watched her face as the numbers tumbled out of my mouth. Her eyes widened, her hand holding the spatula paused in midair. I told her about the clause in the divorce papers, about my suspicion that Raymond knew. When I finished, she turned off the burner and came to sit at the table opposite me. She was silent for a long moment, her brow furrowed. Loretta was 4 years younger than me, more fiery, more prone to speaking her mind. Where I was analytical, she was intuitive. "That no-good scheming snake," she said, her voice low and furious. I knew it. I knew there was something else going on. It wasn't just about that little girl. "What do you mean?" I asked. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table. About 3 weeks before he served you with those papers. I saw him. I was meeting some of the ladies from church for lunch at Pascal's. He was there, sitting in a booth in the back, with some man. What kind of man? Slick, she said, the word dripping with disdain. Shiny suit, shiny shoes, shiny teeth. Looked like one of those financial planner types. They were huddled over a laptop, looking real serious. I almost went over to say hello, but the way they were talking, it felt private. Secret. A cold dread crept up my spine. Did you hear anything they said? Just a snippet, she said, closing her eyes to concentrate. I was walking past their booth on the way to the ladies' room. Raymond was talking. He said something like, "The old man was always healthy as a horse, but you never know." Then he asked the other guy if there was a way to check on something like that without anyone knowing. My breath hitched. He had been asking about our father's health, not out of concern, as a variable in a financial calculation. And I remember something else, Loretta continued, her eyes snapping open. The slick guy said something about timing. He said, "The timing has to be perfect, after the fact, but before the—" And then his voice got real low, and I couldn't hear the last word. Before the transfer, before the call from Calvin Reese. It was all there, a carefully planned operation. Raymond hadn't just left me. He had set a snare for me on his way out the door. The grief I felt for my marriage began to curdle, changing into something colder, harder. It was the feeling of a foundation shifting beneath your feet. The realization that the house you've lived in for 38 years was never built on solid ground. "Mimi, what are you going to do?" Loretta asked, her voice soft with concern. I looked past her, out the kitchen window to the backyard. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, their heavy blue heads nodding in the slight breeze. My father had planted them the year our son, David, was born. He said a house wasn't a home until it had roots in the ground. "I'm going to do what Daddy would have done," I said. "I'm going to be patient, and I'm going to be prepared." The following week was a blur of calculated activity. I had a second, longer meeting with Calvin. We sat in his conference room for 4 hours, mapping out a strategy. He was methodical, calm, and possessed a quiet intensity that I found deeply reassuring. He explained the legal mechanics of what Raymond would attempt, the motions he would file, the arguments he would make. "Their entire case will rest on the assertion that you had prior knowledge," Calvin explained, pacing slowly before the wall of windows. "They'll call it constructive knowledge. They'll argue that because you helped your father with the initial investment, you should have known about its growth. They will paint you as deceptive, as hiding a massive asset during the divorce." "But that's absurd," I said. "It was 40 years ago. I was a kid." "Of course it's absurd. But in a courtroom, absurdity can be persuasive if it's repeated often enough. Our job is to make it impossible to repeat. We need to build a wall of evidence so high they can't see over it." That was when he gave me the letter. He slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the table. It was unsealed. My name was written on the front, in my father's distinctive hand. Strong, slanted, an engineer's script. My fingers trembled as I took it. The paper felt thick, important. Inside was a single sheet of matching stationery. The letter was dated 6 months after my father's diagnosis, a time when he knew his days were numbered. The words were simple, direct, and so profoundly my father that I could hear his voice as I read them. "My dearest Miriam, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means you are free. I pray you are well. I have left instructions with Mr. Reese. He is a good man and will see to everything. There is a provision I have made for you. It is the fruit of a seed you planted a long time ago. I only tended the garden. You showed me where to dig. Do not think of this as a gift. Think of it as a tool. A house should be built on rock, not sand. I have watched you for many years, trying to build your life on sand. It is not your fault. Love can make us blind to the ground beneath our feet. Wait until she's free. That's what I told Mr. Reese. Then give her what's hers, so she can build her own house on her own rock. Be well, my daughter. Your loving father. Ezekiel. Tears burned the back of my eyes, hot and sharp, but I did not let them fall. I folded the letter with meticulous care and placed it back in the envelope. This was not just a letter. It was an affidavit. It was my father's testimony, reaching across the veil to protect me one last time. It was proof that the timing of this revelation was his design, not my deception. This is our anchor, Calvin said softly. But we need more. We need to prove their intent. Loretta saw him, I said, and I recounted the story of Raymond meeting the financial advisor at Pascal's. Calvin made a note. A witness. Good, but circumstantial. What we really need is a direct communication, something that shows they were discussing this, planning it. The thought seemed impossible. How could we get inside their private conversations? But then a strange memory surfaced. It was from a few months before Raymond left. He had been complaining about his new phone, how complicated it was, how he couldn't find his old contacts. He had been a man who resisted technology, who still wrote checks at the grocery store. I, on the other hand, had set up our family's entire digital life. Cloud accounts, shared calendars, automatic backups. I had done it all to make his life easier. When he left, I had methodically scrubbed him from my digital world. I changed passwords, unlinked accounts. But had he? Had he untangled himself from the web I had so carefully woven? That evening, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I navigated to the cloud service we had used for years. I still had the family administrator account. With a sense of clinical detachment, I accessed the device backup logs. His old phone, the one he had complained about, was still listed, and it had performed a final automatic backup the day before he had it disconnected. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was simply following a thread of curiosity. I restored the backup to a virtual drive on my computer. It was a digital ghost of the end of my marriage. Photos, contacts, calendars, and text messages. It took me less than 10 minutes to find it. It was a conversation between Raymond and a contact labeled Arthur Vance, financial. I scrolled back weeks, months. It was all there. Their initial meeting. Vance explaining the potential of an inheritance recapture. Raymond feeding him information about my father, about my career at the USDA. And then, the final piece, a text from Arthur Vance to Raymond, sent just 1 week ago. It read, "The 90 days are up. Our source at the probate court confirms no major estate filings under her father's name in the past 2 years. That means it's likely in a trust, undisclosed. We have everything we need. If she doesn't know yet, file the motion Monday. The element of surprise is our biggest advantage." I stared at the screen. The element of surprise. The clinical, predatory language of it stole my breath. They weren't just exploiting a loophole. They were hunting. I took a screenshot. I printed it in triplicate. I saved the file to a thumb drive. I felt no rage, no hysteria. Just a profound, chilling clarity. The fog had finally lifted. I saw everything and everyone for exactly what they were. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. Raymond's new attorney, a man named Peterson, had filed the motion to reopen, just as Vance's text had predicted. Calvin had requested a 4-way conference, a mandatory step before a court hearing. It was to take place in Calvin's office, our turf. I chose my clothes that morning with the care of a soldier preparing a uniform. A simple navy blue dress, a string of my mother's pearls, low heels. My armor was composure. Loretta called me as I was about to leave. "You okay, Mimi?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "I'm fine, Retta," I said. "You remember what Daddy used to say, when that old oak tree fell in the yard after the storm?" I smiled faintly. "I remember. He said, 'Never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it.'" "That's right," she said. "Don't you let them drag you down into the mud with them. You stand on your rock." "I will," I said. "Talk to you later." Calvin's conference room was filled with late morning sunlight. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the sky outside. Calvin sat at the head. I sat to his right. We waited. Raymond and his attorney arrived exactly on time. Raymond looked smaller than I remembered. He wore a suit that was a little too tight in the shoulders, and he avoided my gaze, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. His lawyer, Peterson, was the opposite. He was tall, confident, with the easy smile of a man who believes he holds all the cards. He was, I realized, the man Loretta had described from Pascal's. The shiny suit, the shiny shoes. He was Arthur Vance, using his lawyer title now that the hunt was on. "Mr. Reese, Miss Baines," he said, his voice smooth. "Thank you for meeting with us. I'm sure we can resolve this matter efficiently." He used my married name, a deliberate choice. "It's Miss Okafor," I said quietly. His smile didn't falter. He and Raymond took the seats opposite us. A paralegal from his firm sat beside him, opening a laptop. "Let's not waste time," Peterson began, laying a file on the table. "We have filed a motion to reopen the dissolution settlement based on the discovery of a significant, undisclosed marital asset. To be specific, the inheritance from Ms. Okafor's father, Ezekiel Okafor." Calvin listened patiently, his hands steepled before him. "On what grounds do you believe such an asset exists?" Peterson chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. "Come now, Mr. Reese. We're all professionals here. We have reason to believe Miss Okafor has recently come into a substantial inheritance, an inheritance she had constructive knowledge of and willfully concealed during discovery." He looked at me then, his eyes cold. "Your client helped her father, a man of modest means, make a few investments decades ago. Are we to believe she, a trained commodities analyst, never once inquired as to the performance of that portfolio, a portfolio that is now, we believe, worth a considerable sum? My relationship with my father was not transactional, Mr. Peterson," I said, my voice even. "I'm sure it wasn't," he said, his tone suggesting the exact opposite. "But the law is. The recapture clause in the settlement, which your client signed, is quite clear. We are prepared to take this to a judge. We will subpoena records. We will file for a temporary freeze on all of Ms. Okafor's assets, and we will engage in a very public, very thorough discovery process." It was the threat Calvin had predicted. The threat of public humiliation, of having my life, my father's life, dissected in a courtroom. It was the moment where I was supposed to flinch, to look to my lawyer with panicked eyes. I did not. I simply looked at Raymond. For the first time, he met my gaze. I saw no remorse in his eyes. I saw a flicker of the old resentment, the bitterness of a man who felt chronically shortchanged by life. And I saw something else. Fear. He was afraid this wouldn't work. Calvin leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Peterson, before you continue down that path, there are a few items you should be aware of. First, the asset in question is not an inheritance. It is a trust, established in 1985, with Ms. Okafor as the sole beneficiary. The distribution of that trust, was triggered by an event stipulated by the grantor, Mr. Okafor himself. He slid a copy of my father's letter across the table. This is a letter of instruction from Mr. Okafor to me, his attorney. Please note the date, and please note his explicit instructions regarding the timing of the disclosure to his daughter. Peterson picked up the letter. His confident smile tightened at the edges as he read. He pushed it toward Raymond, who scanned it quickly, his face paling. This is self-serving," Peterson stammered, recovering. "It doesn't negate the issue of constructive knowledge. She's an expert in the field." She knew. This letter is a convenient fiction to hide that fact. "My father and I did not discuss his finances," I said. "He was a private man." "A judge will find that hard to believe," Peterson shot back. "Perhaps," Calvian said smoothly, "but a judge might also be interested in the intent behind your motion. You see, we believe this isn't about a good faith belief in an undisclosed asset. We believe this is a premeditated attempt to exploit a clause you yourselves inserted into the settlement agreement." Peterson scoffed. "That's a serious and unfounded allegation." "Is it?" Calvin asked. He looked at me. It was my turn. I reached into my handbag and retrieved a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. I placed it on the table. "I believe this belongs to you, Mr. Vance," I said, using his other name. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Raymond flinched as if struck. I unfolded the paper. It was the printout of the text message. "Our source at the probate court confirms no major estate filings," I read aloud, my voice clear and steady. "That means it's likely in a trust, undisclosed. If she doesn't know yet, file the motion Monday. The element of surprise is our biggest advantage." I pushed the paper toward the center of the table. The silence that followed was absolute. The color drained from Peterson's face. He looked at Raymond with pure fury. Raymond shrank in his chair, his gaze fixed on the damning words on the page. The shiny, confident man was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. "Where did you get this?" Peterson whispered, his voice hoarse. "My ex-husband was never very good with technology," I said simply. He left a few doors open on his way out. Peterson, or Vance, stared at the paper, his mind clearly racing, searching for a way out. "This is inadmissible. It's a violation of privacy. It proves nothing." "It proves intent," Calvin said, his voice like cold steel. "It proves that your motion was filed not in good faith, but as a predatory action based on illegally obtained information about my client's father's health and a calculated guess about his estate planning. It is, in short, evidence of attempted fraud." He let that word hang in the air. Fraud. "Now," Calvin continued, his tone shifting back to one of professional calm, "you have two options. You can withdraw your motion immediately, and we will consider this matter closed. Or we can proceed. We will submit this communication as evidence. We will put your client on the stand and ask him about his meetings with you prior to filing for divorce. We will put Ms. Okafor's sister on the stand to testify about the conversation she overheard. And we will file a complaint against you, Mr. Vance, with the State Bar for professional misconduct." He paused. "The choice is yours." Peterson stared at Calvin, then at me. There was no argument left, no bluster. He had been so sure of my weakness, of my ignorance. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption that I was a grieving, passive victim. He had miscalculated. They both had. He slowly reached out, took the printout, and folded it, his movements stiff. He slid it into his briefcase. He looked at Raymond with utter contempt. "The motion will be withdrawn this afternoon," he said, his voice clipped. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "We're done here. He turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance. Raymond remained seated, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen him. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. For what? I wasn't sure. Forgiveness? Understanding? A share? Mimi? He started, his voice a dry rasp. With the business failures and Giara, I was in a corner. I looked at the man I had shared a life with, the man I had loved, supported, and built a family with. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity. Just a vast empty space where 38 years of my life used to be. The betrayal wasn't about the money. It was about the revelation that my husband's respect for me was so shallow that he believed I could be this easily deceived. He had never really seen me at all. The house should be built on rock, not sand, I said, quoting my father. He stared at me, uncomprehending. I stood up. Goodbye, Raymond. I walked out of the conference room, leaving him sitting alone at the long, polished table. The aftermath was quiet. The motion was withdrawn. Calvin and his team worked efficiently to have the trust assets formally transferred to my name. There were documents to sign, accounts to be set up. The numbers were still abstract, but the security they represented was not. It was freedom. It was the rock my father had promised. I didn't change my life in any grand way. I still lived in my house on Cascade Road. I still sang in the church choir. I still had fish fries with Loretta on Fridays. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. The hollowness left by Raymond's departure was being filled, not with new love or new things, but with a profound sense of my own history, my own strength. A few weeks after the meeting, I was in the kitchen, cleaning out a cabinet, when I came across the 2 business proposals for the ventures Raymond had started with my money. The paper felt thin and flimsy in my hands. I looked at the optimistic projections, the confident mission statements. $290,000 of my own premarital savings gone. I had never thought of it as a loss. I had thought of it as an investment in our shared future. I walked them out to the trash bin and dropped them inside. I didn't feel anger. I felt light. It was the shedding of a long, heavy weight. That evening, I stood at the stove, heating up oil in my father's skillet. I ran my hand over the handle, its iron surface worn smooth by decades of use. This skillet had fried fish for my wedding reception, for my children's birthday parties, for countless Sunday dinners. It had survived everything. It held the memory of my father's hands, my mother's mine. It was a legacy, real, tangible, and true. Raymond had tried to take a future I didn't even know I had, but he couldn't touch my past. He couldn't touch the things that had truly made me who I was. The oil shimmered, ready. I laid a piece of cornmeal-dusted fish into the pan. It sizzled, a comforting, familiar sound in the quiet of my home. My home. Built at last on solid rock.